All right, we'll give a few more minutes for the rest of the attendees to join us. We currently have about 20 on the webinar out of 60 who have registered.
It's like a Dodger game. It's a late arriving crowd.
You can hit the grand slam today, Tony?
Oh, yeah.
All right, why don't we give it one more minute? We have 25 people on currently, and we'll give it another minute, and then we'll get started. All right, why don't we get started? Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Greg Meese, the president of the New Jersey Wireless Association. And we have a very informative webinar planned today and a terrific panel of experts to discuss the pole attachment issues. But before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to make a few brief announcements. First, the New Jersey Wireless Association has created the Stephen Weiss Memorial Scholarship. The scholarship honors Steve Weiss, who many of you probably knew and worked with while he was the development manager at Verizon Wireless. Steve was also a cherished board member of the New Jersey Wireless Association and tragically died last year. The association has created a scholarship in his honor, and there will be up to 5 scholarships awarded of up to $5,000 each to students enrolled in an institution of higher education. To be eligible, you must be a member of the Wireless Association or a family member of a member, or a sponsor of the New Jersey Wireless Association or an employee of a sponsor, or an active member of SEEDS, and SEEDS is a favorite charity of the association. Its goal is to motivate high-achieving students from low-income families to attain education opportunities. The information regarding the scholarship is on the website. The applications must be received by December 6th, and the award will be made by December 20th. So if you're interested, please take a look at the website. Second, this year in Atlantic City, the association will hold a daytime seminar series on Wednesday at the Hard Rock. The event will start at 7:30 a.m. and run till 2 p.m. And there's some great topics and speakers. The first panel will be on private networks, and that'll be moderated by Dominic Valecco, and it'll feature Andy Penley, the Chief Technical Officer of Bolden, Peter Cappiello, CEO of Future Technologies Ventures, Rachel Ray, Vice President of Operations of Boingo, Carl Bassano, Director of RAN at AT&T, and Eric McClanahan, Director of 5G Private Networks at Verizon. The private networks is a growing field for the wireless industry, so that should be a very interesting panel. That'll be followed by a regulatory roundtable moderated by Carmen Rajamani. And Carmen is the Vice President of Government Affairs of the Wireless Industry Association. And she will be joined by Assemblyman Wayne D'Angelo, who is the chairman of the New Jersey Assembly Telecom and Utilities Committee, Sanyuri Rajapanki, who is the FCC Senior Counsel in the Competition and Infrastructure Policy Division of the FCC's Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Adrian Berezewski, Vice President of Dynamic Environmental Associates, and the panel will discuss some of the ongoing regulatory issues and permitting reform that has occurred both in the state and federal level. Following that, Rick Morose, a former president of the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, will give a discussion on cybersecurity. Rick is an excellent speaker, and this is a very important topic. And last, we have a keynote speaker, Jennifer Frisky. Jennifer is co-head of North American Telecom Digital Infrastructure at Greenhill & Company. Some of you may remember that Jennifer is a telecom analyst who addressed the association in Morristown a few years ago. And she will discuss the telecom industry, the carriers, how much money they're looking to spend next year, and where they're looking to spend it. So that should be a terrific event. Following the seminars on Wednesday night, the largest wireless party in America take place at the Hard Rock at the New Jersey Wireless Association annual holiday party. Anyone who hasn't been there, I think you'll have a great time. Last year, I think we had over 600 people present. We've modified it a little bit this year. We're going to start at 5 p.m. and allow for 3.5 hours of networking until 8:30. And then at 8:30, the band plan will perform for 1 hour from 8:30 to 9:30 at Sound Waves Theater at the Hard Rock. So let me now introduce the three panelists. First is Colleen Connolly. Colleen is the partner and chief executive officer of Shared Design Group. Colleen has over 30 years engineering experience. She holds a bachelor's of science degree in civil engineering from Stevens Institute of Technology and has obtained professional engineering licenses in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. I've worked with Colleen on numerous small cell projects, and she is an expert in technical requirements of pole attachments. And welcome, Colleen. It's great to have you here. Ed Purcell. Ed is a colleague of mine who concentrates his law practice in the area of land use and planning and a specific emphasis in telecommunications law. Ed is knowledgeable on all aspects of zoning law, state development regulations, and telecommunications regulations. Ed has lectured and written widely on areas related to telecommunications, public rights of way, and land use and municipal law. He serves as a trustee of the New Jersey Institute of Local Government Attorneys and as an editor of the New Jersey Local Government Law Review, and also a co-editor of the Land Use Citator, which is a yearly compendium of land use decisions published by the New Jersey Institute for Continuing Legal Education. He is a former director of the New Jersey State Bar Association Land Use Section and associate counsel of the New Jersey League of Municipalities. And finally, Tony Supa. And Tony is a professional engineer and certified municipal engineer in the state of New Jersey. Tony has been in the wireless industry since 1996. He's currently a project manager with Public Service Electric and Gas, where Tony manages all third-party attachments to PSE&G electric transmission towers, distribution poles throughout the state of New Jersey. Prior to working at PSE&G, Tony engineered the designs of wireless infrastructure on electric transmission towers, monopoles, water tanks, rooftops, and other structures throughout New Jersey and New York. He has testified before hundreds of planning and zoning boards in both New Jersey and New York. And he's active in the Utilities Technology Council, where he's responsible for their wireless co-location efforts. He's a graduate of Newark College of Engineering and is a member of the executive committee of the New Jersey Wireless Association. So we have three great experts here today, and welcome all three. And Ed, if you would now give a brief overview of the presentation so we can get started.
I think Colleen's going to be back.
Okay, I'll jump in there. Thank you very much, Greg. So over the past 10 years, the need for broadband and wireless communication attachments to utility poles in the public right-of-way has increased rapidly. And now municipalities' own needs for equipment within the right-of-way are changing, evolving, and definitely expanding. This has required regulatory agencies, utility companies, and municipalities to quickly develop processes and regulations and continue to evolve those to address these developing technologies. Today, we hope to shed some light on these regulations and also the changes. First, I will be speaking to regulations concerning attachments to utility poles. Then Tony will be providing the utility company perspective and process. And lastly, Ed will give a legal overview of regulatory. After that, time permitting, we will have a Q&A session So please use the Q&A button below on your screen to submit any questions you may have, and hopefully we'll get to your question at the end and be able to answer it. So with that, I am going to jump in. Can I have my first slide? So pole attachments or any attachments to wood utility poles are governed by the National Electric Safety Code. This is the code that governs anything that's on the supply side of the electricity grid. So this would be anything before the meter or that's governed by the utility. I say that to make sure that there's no confusion with the National Electric Code, which is NEC, and that's what governs everything on the customer side, the load side, anything that's after the meter. The latest version of the NESC is 2023. And in that code change, they did clarify that the code is intended to primarily address the practical safeguarding of persons. Now, this was a change from previous versions, which said that it was for the safeguarding of persons and utility facilities. So there is a little bit of an evolution of the code to clarify that it's really about safety clearances, and things of that nature. Now, in that new code change, there was another change. Antennas are now governed under Rule 238F, which recognizes antennas as equipment rather than as rigid conductors, which they were previously listed under. NESC also provides some direction on the structural analysis. There were some changes in that with the new 2023 adoption, but don't worry, I am not going to bore you with that today. But all of that is to say that this is the code, NESC is the code that governs, and the pole owners can modify that to make it more strict, again, more to protect their facilities where NESC is to protect persons. Next slide, please. Now, on a utility pole, there are some distinct areas. There is the supply space, which that's the area that covers any electrical lines. Now, for anyone to work in this space, to work on anything in that supply space, they have to be trained and certified. So that's obviously the most dangerous area, if you will, to be working in. Now, below that, you have a communications workers safety zone. This is an area, as the name suggests, to provide a buffer between that supply space with the electricity and the communication space. And the communication space is where you would have any of your fiber lines, cable TV, telephone lines. The communication worker safety zone is to allow a buffer between those, and you are only allowed in that space to have span wires, brackets, conductor drip loops that are associated with lights or traffic signals that may be attached to the pole. You can also have wires routed vertically through that space, but they need to be in compliance with Rule 239, which addresses how they needed to be shielded or covered. Next slide, please. Here I'm showing the minimum vertical clearances that are necessary. This would be if you're running a new, whether a communication line or running an electrical line. Typically, we're dealing with going over a public road, alley, or commercial driveway. You have to have 15.5 feet clearance. Now, this is at the lowest point of your conductor. Generally, as a rule of thumb, this translates into a 16-foot minimum clearance to your attachment to the pole, which allows for some sag in the wires. If you have an unusual topography, then you may need to attach higher on your pole to make sure that you're getting that minimum. And as you can see with the other two clearances, if you're over a state highway or an interstate, or if you're over a railroad, you're going to need some additional clearance. In addition to what it says in NESC, you definitely want to check with whatever authority has jurisdiction, either over that roadway or railroad, to make sure you're maintaining the minimums that they require. Next slide. Additionally, horizontal clearances are necessary. This would be if you're putting in a new conductor, or in the case of putting in, say, a decorative light pole or something of that nature, you want to make sure you have the proper clearances, whether it's from primary electric lines, secondary electric lines, or communication lines. Next slide. In some jurisdictions, some pole owners will allow the climbing of their poles. So as that suggests, someone would actually climb up the poles to work on them. In those areas, you need to make sure you allow for a 30-inch by 30-inch clear area to allow someone to access the pole. As you can see from this diagram, in those cases, you really are going to be restricted with how much equipment or where you can put the equipment on the pole. So make sure you check with the pole owner to see if a climbing zone is needed. Next slide. Here I'm showing just a typical attachment of a small cell on a utility pole. Now this is a utility pole with only secondary power. If there is primary power on the pole, so that would be higher voltage lines, typically you will have your secondary power at either 480 or 240 volt would be the lower of the electric lines on a pole. And then above that would be primary at the higher voltage. If you have that case, check in with the pole owner, check in with the electric company. Their rules may or may not allow you to put your antennas or any equipment above that point. So this is looking at a pole with just secondary power. I'm going to start from the bottom and sort of build the pole up with some clearances. At the bottom, you will have your meter pan. In this case, we're going to have a metered electrical service to this. The height of that meter pan is dictated by the electric company to allow for their meter readers to be able to see it properly. Next, above that, we're going to have an equipment cabinet. The underclearance for the equipment cabinet may be dictated by the owner of the equipment, who may want it at a certain height in order to deter from vandalism. The municipality may have some input or some regulations about the height clearance to the base, just to have uniformity of attachments within their municipality. And the owner of the pole may also have some regulations, whether it's a climbing zone type regulation or just their standard for where they want that set. Absent any of that input, you want to make sure that if that equipment cabinet is over top of a sidewalk or an area where there could be pedestrian access, I'm going to provide 7.5 feet of clearance, and that's as per ADA regulations. Clearance between the top of your cabinet and the lowest communication line really will be dictated mainly by whoever is using that cabinet. You want to allow enough space, even though any SC will say you can go down to 6 inches, that may not be enough space for whoever needs to get into that equipment cabinet and work to do so without, basically hitting their head on a communication line. Generally, want to provide 18 to 24 inches from the top of the equipment to the lowest communication line. As I said previously, that attachment in this case of that existing telco line would be at 16 feet above grade. Your minimum in between communication lines that are existing would be 6 inches. You're going to put a proposed in or relaying out a new pole. You want to give the preferred of 12 inches between communication lines. Above that top fiber line that I'm showing here, now is where that communication worker safety zone comes into play. And that is a 40-inch clearance, which would be measured from your top communication line, which is the end of your comm space, and measured up to the lowest electrical line, which would be the start of the supply space. So in this case, we're going to the weatherhead that is proposed for the service. Between any secondary electric lines, you're going to have 12-inch minimum. If there was primary, you would need to look in NESC to see what those clearances are based on the differences in voltage. After the top of the supply space, we again need to have that buffer, that communication worker safety zone of 40 inches measured to where the antenna is. Next slide, and that rounds me out.
Thank you, Colleen. That you made very technical information sound very simple. Thank you very much. And we'll take your lead and let's check in with the owner of the pole and the public utility, Tony Supa.
Thank you, Greg. Colleen, great job. Thank you. So as a representative for Public Service Electric and Gas, I'm going to try to give you information from the utility standpoint, but keep in mind that there are other utilities in New Jersey. There's First Energy and Atlantic City Electric. And although our rules and regulations and processes are similar, they're not always the same. So the main takeaway I'm going to give you today is, when in doubt, please reach out to me, my team, Trevor, and that's always the best way to start off with any project you want to do with anything on our poles. So at PSE&G, we have 2 million customers for electric customers, more than 4,000 transmission towers, 800,000 poles. Some of them are joint. And our group has been handling the transmission tower attachments going back to, well, PSE&G has been doing it since 1998. I got in around the year 2000. And in 2019, we saw what was going to happen with small cells. So we went to senior management at PSE&G and asked that the small cells go under our group, which wasn't before, because we figured we had the expertise to be able to handle the avalanche of work that we knew was coming. So in 2019, we took over small cell attachments on our distribution poles and had to quickly come up with a new process, a new system. And we were able to do that with the great team I have here at PSE&G. And then we, over the next couple of years, and after 2019, I think we had over 2,000 applications for small cell antennas. So being prepared was a big help, and working with some really good people on the other side helped a lot as well. So the pole attachments, where are we and where we're going from our perspective? What I'm going to talk about is the small cell 5G antennas, and the other big slug of work we're getting now is requests to mount surveillance cameras on our poles. As you might imagine, having surveillance cameras everywhere, our poles are really attractive, and also having license plate readers mounted on our poles. And PSE&G, as a practice, never allowed license plate readers on our poles because our union didn't really want to be known as a law enforcement group. But the state police got some extremely large grants over the last 12 to 18 months, went to senior management at PSE&G, and we agreed to partner with the law enforcement and municipalities all over New Jersey. And we now accept applications for surveillance cameras and license plate readers on our distribution poles. And it's a tremendous amount of work we're getting right now. So let's start. First thing, agreement, standard, and guidelines. The first thing, if someone wants to attach a camera, a small cell site, a license plate reader on any of our distribution poles, you need to have an executed agreement in place, a master agreement. For a small cell and for distribution poles, it's not as cumbersome as the master agreement for our transmission towers, but you still need to have an agreement in place before we start. And each specific pole attachment must have a contract or a license or a site license agreement or be part of an exhibit. So when we have an agreement with, say, the town of Westfield, New Jersey for surveillance cameras, we have an exhibit that shows all those surveillance cameras, where they're located. Same for if we have an agreement with a wireless carrier to have small cells. We want to have that list of small cells in that agreement, so anybody can pick it up and see where all those attachments are. And that could always be updated at any time, but that's for, we need that for our data to be able to keep track of all these attachments on our poles. The utility should develop its own engineering and construction guidelines for third-party pole attachments. So we have that. We've developed pole attachment guidelines and a process, and we've updated it several times already. And we just recently developed and updated a new process for surveillance cameras and license plate readers, in addition to small cell sites. Standards, we have standards, which, like as Colleen was explaining to you a little while ago, which will tell you how big you can make that equipment cabinet, what height the meter should be at. Do we even need meters for license plate readers and surveillance cameras? So we have those standards, limitations and restrictions. As you might imagine, there's a lot of limitations and restrictions on these distribution poles. There is electric service at the top, which makes it a dangerous condition. But we try to be as flexible as possible. My group, we try to be as flexible as possible to work with the utility, to work with the police departments and law enforcement, and try to partner with everybody, not just say no. If we say no to one situation, we try to route you to another, maybe another pole or another area where your proposal can work. One of the things we like that we've always used going back to the transmission tower processes days, we always wanted to have approved utility A&E firms who will do all our work. We didn't just want to let the customer or the wireless carrier come in with a different A&E firm for every project. So we came up with a list of approved AE firms. And if you work with us, you know who those firms are. Colleen's one of them. And this is good because they know our processes, especially our safety requirements. They know how they're the quarterback that helps that customer get this project through from A to Z. We're not as difficult to work with as you think we are. We're actually pretty good. We usually have 30-day turnaround times on everything, and we usually return everything with less than 2 weeks. But having that utility-approved AE firm is a big help for us, and I believe for the customers. We also have a utility-approved radio frequency engineering firms for the same purpose. They're working on our small cell sites. We want the same people working on them that understand our processes, our requirements, and things like that. And we also have utility-approved contractors that are able to build these sites. So we have a list of about 8 to 10 contractors. And if a carrier wants to build a small cell site, they must use one of those utility-approved contractors. As for surveillance cameras and license plate readers, we have not gotten to the point yet where we're requiring drawings, signed and sealed drawings, structural reports, because it's a small camera. It's a small license plate reader, but I don't know if we're going to be in that position for going forward, because the surveillance camera systems are getting more complicated. There's more equipment that goes with the surveillance camera on the pole. And the same thing with the license plate readers. There's usually multiple license plate readers on the poles. And also sometimes they'll have antennas, microwave shot, an equipment cabinet. So what we're seeing is when we ask the customer to provide us with technical specifications, we're not just seeing one small camera. Well, sometimes we are, and then we have to pull it out of them. Well, send us everything. And next thing you know, you have a whole laundry list of equipment that you're putting on the pole. So we're working through this right now. And like I said, as of now, we don't require drawings. We don't require we don't require an approved contractor either. But like I said, that may change in the future as these systems get more complex. Project kickoff meeting. If you're doing any work on any of our poles, I would always say reach out to us first, and let's schedule a project kickoff meeting if it involves, maybe more than one camera, more license plate reader, or a small cell. If you're doing a series of upgrades, maybe 10, 20 upgrades, or if you have 10, 20 new sites, come in, sit down, meet with us. Let's sit down and talk about the size and the scope of your project, the location of the project, what your timelines are, and we could tell you if our timelines match. And we could go through our utility review process from A to Z, so you know what you're getting into. So the customer if you're working for a wireless carrier, everybody's on board. And we seem to have a lot of success with the project kickoff meetings. So let's talk a little bit about small cell attachments. As I've indicated, probably over the last couple of years, well, the last couple of years, actually, the work has slowed down. And for us, the small cell work has slowed down to a crawl, maybe just some scattered upgrades here or there, no new big projects. But from 2019 to maybe 2022, like I said, we received over 2,000 applications for small cell sites and some big decorative light pole projects, which have been put on hold, and we hope those can come back. So for a small cell project, just briefly, the process, the wireless carrier provides a skip, and we require a skip because we modeled it after our transmission tower process, which we feel is pretty successful. The skip for each individual site and application will provide us with the information we need to look at everything and be able to analyze each individual small cell on its own merit. The utility is to perform a desktop review of the skip. So we'll take a look at it from our desktop without going out there. And then if we think it's a good candidate, we'll schedule a site design visit for each proposed small cell installation. And some might think that's overkill, but we don't think so, because on paper, some sites might look good, like Colleen said. Then you go out there and you see that the site is next to the edge of a driveway. There's a school bus stop. Kids are driving through there, riding through with bicycles, and you have a cabinet. So we like to look at each individual site, especially on a safety basis, make sure that it's a good candidate for a small cell site. So we go out and we do the desktop review. We'll schedule a site design visit for each proposed small cell installation that we feel is a good candidate. And following a successful site design visit, the wireless carrier or their approved AE will submit construction drawings, structural analysis, and an RF report for each site. And also, what we require is the right-of-way agreement for that package of sites or that group of sites within that municipality. Once we have all that, we review it, and that's and you're off to the races. Next slide, please. Okay, this is slide 2 of 34. Everybody relax. So surveillance cameras and automated license plate reader pole attachments. So, well, I just finished with, I'm sorry, let me go back. Small cell was, you submit all that information to us, we review it. If everything looks good and we approve everything, we then schedule you for construction. You let us know when you're going to go out and build it, and we'll go out and just check, make sure it was built correctly. And then one other important fact, it's not really our group, but once you have submitted everything for us to review, you'll be submitting for electric service, and that's a different part of PSE&G. And it's really important that when you do that, you have a lot of clarity on your drawings and explain exactly what you're doing, where the pole is, where you're putting your antennas. And then that group will review and let you know when you can expect electric service. And we can help out with that, but just the important point is it doesn't go through our group. Okay. That goes through the construction inquiry group, by the way, at PSE&G. So surveillance. So if you're working for someone, a township, if you're working for a police department, and you're out there and you're a site act person or you're an engineer, and you want to put surveillance cameras and or automated license plate readers on our poles, you need to provide material specifications and pole locations to us. And you need to let us know if it's a joint pole. So the poles are all numbered. If the number is 60,000 or greater, it's a joint pole. If it's less than 60,000, it's a PSE&G pole. If you're going to install a camera or a license plate reader on a joint pole, you would go through Verizon on that. They would manage the installation and the approval of the camera and the license plate reader. And then you would come to us for the electric service. But anyway, going back, we would perform a desktop review of the material specifications and your pole locations. And then you would need a license agreement with PSE&G to put these cameras and license plate readers on our poles. And the customer would install it. We would go out and do an as-built walk when all the cameras and license plate readers are installed. The surveillance cameras and license plate readers is an unmetered service. We would provide the electricity and the service, but it's an unmetered service where the small cells are 100% metered. Metered service and make-ready work for small cell sites. So once all design documents are approved, as I indicated before, wireless carriers can apply for metered service. When the wireless carrier applies for metered service, we'll determine if make-ready work is required for small cell installation and/or to bring electric service to a proposed small cell site. And the utility will perform the make-ready work if required. And electric service for surveillance camera and license plate reader with attachments. Once technical specs and pole locations are approved, the customer can apply for electric service. And the utility is to work with customer on bringing service to the attachment. Again, many of you out there may not be working on anything to do with surveillance cameras or license plate readers yet, but you may find customers and municipalities or the state police or different law enforcement agencies. You may be working with them in the future to put some of these systems on our poles, especially as they get more complicated, more complex, and more municipalities and law enforcement groups want these cameras and license plate readers up. So that's all I have for that. And now I will hand it off to Ed. Thank you.
Well, actually, Tony, one question before I take it over is, with respect to the license plate readers and the cameras that municipalities may be putting on the poles, does that impact the availability of those poles for small wireless facilities or other types of attachments?
We haven't had that case come up yet, but I would say yes, it does impact. I don't see where we could have both on one pole.
Okay, so basically, a pole that's used for that may not be available then to be used for something else, for a small wireless facility or
correct.
Some other attachment. Okay. Just wanted to clarify that.
And Ed, why don't you give us a little bit of a historic perspective and talk about who regulates pole attachments from a government perspective?
Everyone and no one. My name's Ed Purcell. I practice land use and telecommunications law at Price, Meese, Shulman, and D'Arminio. I represent wireless carriers and broadband providers, wired broadband providers. I'm going to talk a little bit today about regulating the right-of-way pole attachments. I'll just give one disclaimer. I do have a couple pending matters that cover the topics that we're going to be going over. So there's certain areas that I don't, I maybe just brush lightly and don't go into any great detail. It may be because I have some sort of concern with respect to those current disputes that I'm involved in. But I think even aside from that, we can have a very fruitful conversation today. So the topic that we're going to be discussing is regulating pole attachments for broadband, and that's going to be, wireline, wireless. The topic of the seminar generally was, where we are and where we're going. I think I'd like to take a step back and say, where we were, and talk a little bit about the historical perspective here, because for the most part, what's happening is we are taking old laws that were enacted and put into effect to deal with the beginnings of the telecommunications industry over 100 years ago, and applying them to super modern technologies. And so I think it's something that's useful as a starting point to talk about, what that was like before those laws went into place. Next slide, please. And the answer is it was pretty chaotic before all these laws went into effect and before government stepped in to start regulating pole attachments. I just have a couple examples here just to show you. The first is an article about Westfield from 1909. I know Tony was mentioning Westfield putting up license plate readers on PSE&G's poles. In 1909, Westfield was threatening to cut down those poles. And there was a fair bit of litigation on that point. And another example, the next article in the middle is from 1903, where there were just a number of residents from the article says German Valley, I think that's Long Valley in Morris County, went and went and cut down a number of telephone poles because it was just a new technology, something new, was certainly not understood or appreciated. And then the last one, this set has to do with a gentleman in Helmetta in Middlesex County from 1914 who tried literally cutting down a telephone pole in his front yard because he was so unhappy that I believe it was PSE&G installed it there. So you find these very interesting articles from a real long time ago. And I have one more to show everyone, and then we'll move on. Next slide, please. So this is a cartoon from 1912 from the Star Ledger. And so the first slide is a gentleman looking out his window and sees a couple other gentlemen, out surveying. And he goes up to him and he says, what are you doing? And they say, well, we're putting it in a telephone pole. So the next slide is, he says, well, how about I give you $5 and you put it next to my next door neighbor's property? And they say, oh, great, sure. And then his next door neighbor on the other side comes over and tells him, boy, I apologize. Some gentlemen were going to put a telephone pole in front of my house, and I gave them $5, and they said they're going to put it in front of your house. And then next to last slide is he calls up the utility, the telephone company, and they say, oh, we're not out in front of your house putting up poles. We do everything underground. And then he realizes that he's just been fleeced, basically, because there was such anxiety in 1912 about telephone poles and the installation of those poles. So there was a lot going on then. So how did we respond? How did government decide to regulate these types of installations, to regulate telecommunications? Next slide. So who regulates pole attachments? Local government is one, state government, and to a certain extent, the federal government. But as we'll discuss, when we talk about pole attachments, they've been reversely preempted in New Jersey. So next slide, please. With respect to local government attachments, local government regulation of attachments, this is something that Tony kind of mentioned. Municipal consent is required when attaching to poles that lawfully exist in the right-of-way, and that's NJSA 48:3-19. So when Tony mentioned when you use a PSE&G pole, you need to show municipal consent. That's the statute that requires that municipal consent. It doesn't authorize local government to adjudicate over pole disputes. What it really is meant to do is just ensure that local government has some understanding and some regulation of what goes into the right-of-way so that it manages the ability of the public to pass and repass, just be able to use the streets. That's the municipal interest here, and safety to a certain extent. That kind of goes into the next provision. Municipal consent is required to install a new pole, and that's NJSA 48:17-10. And then for county roads, both municipal and county consent is required, and that's NJSA 16:6-6. I realize there's a typo there. But all of these statutes were adopted, over 100 years ago, and I think we use them pretty regularly from a wireline and wireless broadband perspective when we seek to gain municipal approvals to either attach onto existing poles or to put up new poles within the right-of-way. Next slide, please. So here's where it gets a little stickier when we get to the state government level. Public utilities can appeal local decisions to the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, and that's in the municipal land use law. So a lot of times you'll see this where a PSE&G or a New Jersey Natural Gas will appeal some adverse local determination to the Board of Public Utilities. Technically, a competitive local exchange carrier could do that too. Those are generally the infrastructure providers that provide infrastructure for our wireless carriers, our CLECs. The BPU also has the authority to enjoin a public utilities policies or regulations where same are unjust and unreasonable, or unjustly discriminatory or otherwise in violation of law, and that's NJSA 48:3-2. And that's kind of to piggyback off what Colleen said, she talked about the NESC being the floor for regulation. That's the minimum regulation that a utility can require. I view this as kind of being the ceiling. So, public utility, you can be stricter than the NESC, but, not to the point that those requirements are unjust or unreasonable or discriminatory. The Board of Public Utilities also has jurisdiction to resolve disputes with respect to the repair, replacement, modification of a utility pole, and that's NJAC 14:3-2.3. And generally, I think where I've seen this provision, I think would be pertinent where there's issues about pole ownership. That comes up a lot, I think, with respect to attachers, particularly broadband attachers. Certainly, something that's I should say wireline broadband attachers. I think that's maybe a useful provision. And then also, the BPU has jurisdiction to resolve disputes over terms and conditions of pole attachment agreements. That's assuming that you have a pole attachment agreement. But this often comes up with respect to rates, terms, things like that are all part of the pole attachment agreement. Next slide, please. So the question is, does the state have jurisdiction over pole attachment disputes related to broadband, wireline or wireless attachment on utility poles? And frankly, the answer is maybe, probably, but the BPU has been sort of shying away from this area lately. In 2012, there was what I like to call the fiber tech case. There was a dispute between fiber tech and a public utility with respect to a pole attachment agreement. And fiber tech provided broadband communication services. It wasn't a strictly telecommunications provider, and the board took jurisdiction over that case. But having said that, in talking to the board over the last few years, I think there's maybe becoming a little bit of a reluctance to get in the middle of pole attachment disputes between a broadband provider, whether that be wireline or wireless, and public utilities. I think from a statutory perspective, those statutes that we went over gave them an ability to do that, but my understanding is that there's some reluctance. Next slide. And this kind of goes to the federal government part of it. As you are very much aware, anybody here that does wireless work, state and local regulation of personal wireless service is constrained by the Telecommunications Act of 1996. I think generally we always talk about Section 332C7, and that limits somewhat what can be done by the state or by local government with respect to siting of wireless facilities. My sense is I think maybe the Board of Public Utilities is worried that if it starts regulating pole attachment disputes, that it's going to be entering into this area and displacing the federal government, which I don't think it would be, but I think maybe that's where they're coming from. And I should say, and I mentioned this earlier, there are federal pole attachment rules. But it's a situation where if a state has its own rules and it certifies that has its own pole attachment rules, that then the federal rules don't apply. So I'll just say the federal pole attachment rules are actually pretty good. They've all been updated and would be very helpful for broadband providers with respect to pole attachment disputes. That's wireless and wireline. We don't get to use those in New Jersey because New Jersey has its own statutes and rules that I just went over. And in 1985, the BPU certified to the FCC that it controls pole attachments. Now, there's some question if you certify that you're regulating pole attachments, and pole attachments now, based on federal case law, includes broadband. Are you really regulating pole attachments? Certainly, that's a question. But so the federal government does have some part to play in this, but because of the reverse preemption issue, when we talk about pole attachment disputes, it's mostly a New Jersey issue. Next slide, please. So, with respect to the outlook here, the BPU is going to have to come to grips with its pole attachment jurisdiction issues, with particularly with broadband. It's number three here is the American Broadband Initiative. There's millions and millions of dollars, $42.5 billion have been injected into developing and promoting broadband deployment in the country. $263 million is going to New Jersey. So there's going to be a push to deploy broadband. And as we know, there is certainly a push now to have wireless deployments within the right of way. So I think the BPU is really going to have to come to grips with these issues. I think they're going to be having disputes come to them, and they're going to have to find a way to resolve this because it's a serious and important issue. The other thing that I'll just say from my perspective that I view from an outlook perspective is it's interesting what Tony was saying about the municipal use of poles. Will that use compete with other attachers and impact municipal regulation of attachments? That's possible. What Tony's saying is true is that every one of these poles that there's a camera on or some other municipal tool or technology that can't be used for a small wireless facility. Over time, maybe that will impact it as a practical matter. Maybe towns will say, you can have use of our right of way, but we get first dibs on all poles. I can see that happening. So that's something I think to keep a lookout for on the horizon. So that's about all I have to say with respect to that. Happy to take questions.
Very good. Thank you, Colleen, Tony, Ed. Great presentation. We do have a few minutes left for Q&A. Anybody who has a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we have time for here. And just to start off, quick question for you, Tony. On a pole, how do you tell who owns the pole? If you go to a pole and I want to know who owns it and who to contact, how is that determined?
Sometimes the pole there'll usually be a stencil with a number. Sometimes it'll say PS in front of that, and that's a pretty good indicator it's PSE&G. Like in front of my house in Morris County, there's JC for Jersey Central. But a lot of times it'll just be numbers, and if someone's not sure, they can just call our group and reach out to us, and we'll let them know. They tell us where the pole is, what the number is. We could look that up for them and help them out.
Is there any online database or anything with pole numbers and names, or no? It's got to be contact.
No, that's proprietary information. But the online database is Trevor Whitaker for my group.
And I guess the answer would be, from a legal perspective, is that if two utilities claim ownership over the same pole and there's a dispute, that would be something that the board, would have authority to adjudicate. Who owns what pole.
Yeah, I haven't run into that yet, but I guess that's possible, Ed.
Yeah.
I see from Trevor, he's saying he has built-in GIS. Tony, if two utility companies have pole inventories that don't match up, how is that sorted out?
What do you mean by that, Greg?
Well, PSEG says they own the pole, JCP&L says they own the pole, and Atlantic City Electric says they own the pole.
We would probably set up a meeting or a call with it and try to work it out with them. We have not come into that situation yet.
And last for you, Tony, how many surveillance cameras or license plate readers can you attach to one pole?
So we usually say you could put one camera or one license plate reader, but really it's one customer. So if the town of Boonton wants to come in and get a license agreement to put surveillance cameras on our pole, and they want to put two cameras on, we'll allow it because it's one customer, two cameras. And license plate readers usually go in pairs. One looks one way, one looks the other. This way they make sure they pick you off.
Tony, a question just popped up. What is the typical lifespan of a wood utility pole?
That's a good question. And if someone wants to reach out to me, I'll get them that answer.
Depends whether or not Superstorm Sandy hits, huh?
Yeah, and we inspect them. We have like a group company like Osmos will go out and do all their inspections. So they're regularly inspected, but I'm not sure exactly what the end of life is on these poles.
Is that a question, Colleen, that you would feel? I mean, not that you could say specifically, but in your experience trying to
Yeah.
doing with this with structural analyses for these older poles?
I wouldn't say that there's a typical range, but anytime we do a structural analysis of the pole, we're also going to look at what the condition of the pole is, if it has any cracking, if it's leaning, or just has had deterioration, then we would recommend it to be replaced.
And Colleen, the question is relative to plus or minus 45 years for Section 106 NEPA screening purposes.
I don't know that I can really answer that. If a utility pole is older than 45 years, does that count? I don't have an expertise to tell you that for sure. Are there poles out there that are older than 45 years? Probably not, but I guess there could be.
All right, thank you. This may be a question for all three of you. Is there anything being done to reduce the amount of time it takes to get permitting approvals?
Well, there's a lot being done on the federal level. When we talk about um, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and approvals from local government. There's applicable shot clocks, 60 days to co-locate onto an existing pole to get those approvals, 90 days for a new pole. But when we talk about approvals from a utility for installations on their pole, the problem is that the federal pole attachment rules are very clear on that, and New Jersey's regulations are very unclear. So I don't think there's much being done in that area here in New Jersey. Hopefully there'll be some evolution or change there, but that's where we are now.
Well, here's another question for Tony. Bringing up the town use versus small cell, do you see that coming more into play if the township and the wireless provider were to cooperate and the town use equipment was added to the provider license? There would not be anything inherently preventing your approval? Question mark.
Well, I could tell you that we've already had instances. We have had a municipality wants to put license plate readers on poles that right now are earmarked for Verizon Wireless to be to have future sites on them. So we have, since the Verizon project's on hold and the municipal project's probably going to have some switches to it and changes, we could already see that. Like if you have a big project that may be on hold when you have 150 sites or something, and the next thing you know, the town's coming in and saying, wait, I want 20 of those poles. How are we going to resolve that? We haven't got there yet, but it's definitely something that's going to happen, Greg. We're going to have to deal with both entities.
It's a valuable real estate, right? So other parties can be looking to access.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Another question. I guess this one is for Colleen. Is there any wood pole lean criteria limits that can be looked at from a structural perspective?
This is something where you really have to take it on a case-by-case basis, whether it's looking at why is this pole leaning, or what is creating the issue, and really the configuration of your conductors with regard to how it's leaning. So that's a hard question for me to just answer on a general basis without looking at a specific pole.
All right, great. Well, thank you, everybody. That is all we have time for. To the attendees, please let us know if there's other topics that you would like the association to cover. I think this topic that we had today is one that we'll be seeing a lot more of action on in the coming years because, as Tony mentioned, there's a lot of activity coming from various parties looking for access to the polls. And both the BPU and the FCC, I think, will become very active in this field. So I thank you, Colleen, Tony, Ed. Great job today. Very informative. Really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Greg.
Thank you all for attending.
Have a good day.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.